Hello, this is Stephen Ritchie, and this is Scrum Foundations, an introductory Scrum course. This is Module 3 of 4, where we'll continue talking about Scrum events, specifically the daily Scrum, the review, and the retrospective. The first part is the daily Scrum. So there's a purpose to the daily Scrum, and that is to inspect and adapt. This goes back to the empirical process control that we've talked about in previous modules. Here, what we're going to identify is blockers, and we're going to work to remove them. But we'll also be inspecting the plan generally to see how we're tracking towards progress in this sprint. The frequency is once a day, and the goal is to improve the coordination and track towards achieving that sprint goal. So a daily Scrum is time-boxed. Like all events are time-boxed. It's time-boxed to 15 minutes, but most teams can accomplish the daily Scrum in 5 minutes, depending on how well things are going. The idea of the time box is to focus on what are we doing with regards to the sprint goal. We want to have an efficient meeting. That's why we keep it to 15 minutes or less. And we want to identify these impediments and blockers and have the Scrum Master track them and have follow-up meetings and take further action after the daily Scrum. So the Scrum Master, as I mentioned, is going to ensure that the meeting takes place, that people are participating, that we stick to the time box, and as I mentioned, identify, capture, and follow through on impediments. The goal of a daily Scrum is to capture these sprint goal items, the plan and the impediments. But we want to have a simple mechanism for doing that. So same thing every day. Keep the logistics very simple. Should be the same calendar invite, the same Teams link, or whatever we can do to make it very easy for people to join and participate. We also want to focus on some classic questions. What did I do yesterday to help achieve the sprint goal? What will I do today to aid the sprint goal? Are there impediments preventing the sprint goal? Sometimes the agenda is not necessarily structured this way, but each individual on the dev team should be thinking this way. So an alternate way of running the agenda would be to start with the board and to look at that board from the done side all the way to the to-do side. And the concept here is that the sprint goal is taking everything in the sprint backlog and pulling it across that board. So let's talk about that for just a second. If something is nearly done, what we want to do is we want to figure out what is that waiting on. Does the PO need to review it before it's done? Does an automated test need to be written? That's why we work from the column closest to done, is so that we can pull that work into the done column. We are going to go through each item and have a conversation about it. Is that item on track? Is there anything holding it back? Is there any coordination that needs to be done to move that? So the agenda actually becomes about the team looking at the work in front of them, looking at that sprint backlog as a plan, and drawing focus and pulling items into that done column. Overall, the larger picture is the sprint goal. So what's holding the team back from meeting that sprint goal? Are there broader impediments? And how can we address those? So it's the parts being the item and the whole being the sprint goal that this meeting should focus on. So the things that come into the daily Scrum are that sprint goal. So to the extent possible, let's keep that up and in front of everybody so everybody knows the goal. And the sprint backlog and that is that plan to achieve it. More importantly, the sprint backlog represents the current status of how the team is doing toward that goal. So this meeting should be very focused. How is work flowing? What follow-up needs to happen on any impediments and blockers? Are we all on the same page? And then how are we going to adjust the plan or adapt the plan based on this? Perhaps Sally can't work on this task and Johnny should work on this task. So is there some adjustment that we need? Maybe Sally and Johnny really need to pair up on this. Perhaps somebody is spinning their wheels. These are ways we're adapting the plan to make things move forward. That is the focus of the meeting. After the meeting, some members of the development team will go off and meet. For example, there's a design that needs to be adjusted, or there's some pair programming that needs to happen. So we are going to adjust and address and adapt the plan as an objective sometimes after the meeting. So what are some of the benefits? What we want to see is the team coming together and communicating well. What we should see is that the daily Scrum eliminates the need to have other meetings, right? We don't need to catch up on other things because everybody comes together and looks at what's already represented. The Scrum Master is hearing about impediments and planning to remove them. There's quick decision making because everybody is there. Things can get decided quickly, and knowledge is being shared about what's happening or how designs need to change. So let's do an activity. Go to your workbook, and you'll see a worksheet called Daily Scrum. And on that, there'll be 2 columns. Here, we're going to move cards based on what your team is doing right now, or what the teams that you've worked on have been doing. So there are some things on these cards that your team may already be doing. So let's put that into the continue doing column. And there may be some things on the card where you're like, we're not doing this, so we should start doing it, and put that in the start doing. And then when we get back, we'll talk about it. There are no correct answers. There's just things to be thinking about. Are we doing this? Should we be doing this? Okay, now that you're back, I have just some examples. As I said, there's no correct answer here. So on the hypothetical team here, the dev team should hold the daily Scrum meeting once a day, every day. Let's continue doing that. The daily Scrum meeting should be held at the same time and same way every day. Let's continue doing that. We do that. The team should respect the time box and meet for 15 minutes or less. This hypothetical team is doing that and should continue doing that. So let's talk about what this hypothetical team needs to start doing. So the dev team should review the sprint backlog items as their plan to achieve the sprint goal. So it's an important part of what the team does is it looks at the sprint backlog and that board and that representation of those items and says, how are we doing compared to what we plan to do? The dev team should inspect and adapt ongoing work of the sprint. Here again, we get to the question of we should start thinking about this as inspect what we're doing and adapt the plan. Are we doing that? Are we thinking about what could we be doing different? What could we be doing better? Let's have those conversations. And then the last card, the daily Scrum should identify impediments to development and follow up for their removal. So are we clearly identifying these blockers? Are we saying, hey, I'm stuck. Hey, I need some help getting this resolved. Those should be brought up. The Scrum Master should be taking note of those and making sure that those are followed up to completion. So I'll pause for any questions at this point. The next part is the sprint review. This event is a meeting, and the meeting is held at the end of the sprint. So let's talk a little bit about the infographic on the right here. So the containing event is called the sprint, and we talked about that in the previous module. And we talked about the sprint planning event, which is at the beginning of the sprint. That event created a cycle. We just talked about the daily Scrum, which happens once a day, and we're going to inspect and adapt. Now we've come to the end of the sprint, and that package represents the increment. This is what we've built. And now we're going to have the sprint review meeting. And this event is where we're going to talk about that. So here we're going to talk about the input, which is that increment I just mentioned. The goal of the sprint review meeting, who attends it, what are some time boxes, what's a recommended approach, and what is the output of that meeting. So as I mentioned, the input is that increment developed during the sprint. If the goal of the sprint was met, you should have a new product increment. The focus of the meeting is to inspect that product increment, and the goal is to adapt it based on feedback and discussions. So who attends the sprint review meeting? Well, the entire Scrum team should attend the meeting. Also, the product owner will invite people who have a stake in the outcome of this team, people who are interested in that product increment and who can provide meaningful feedback on that product increment. The time box of this meeting is 1 hour for each week of sprint length. So if we have a 2-week sprint, it should be a 2-hour meeting. In practice, most meetings conclude before the time box expires. And you want to try and focus on the idea that if you've accomplished the goal and all the outputs are met, then you don't need to continue with the rest of the meeting. A time box is a maximum allowed. So the approach is usually in 2 parts. The first is what's known as a demo. And here we have the dev team demonstrate the product increment. We want to answer any questions about the increment in this first part. The second part is a conversation. And here we want to have some collaborative discussion with the stakeholders, the team members. And what we're looking for is ways in which the product backlog provides new information or insights. So let's talk about how that works in practice. While you're demonstrating the product increment, you may be asked questions. Why does this work clockwise instead of counterclockwise? And some of that discussion can, those questions and answers can reveal an upcoming discussion. In the conversation, a stakeholder may say, I know I asked for clockwise, but now that I see it working, I'm thinking counterclockwise would be the better approach. And then there's a discussion. There might be a conversation which says, now that I've seen this in action, I think this feature I wanted is not necessary. I think it's good enough right now. But this other feature we haven't talked about in a while, I think that's more important. So what's happening is there's an adjustment that's happening. The product owner, by showing the working software, is getting meaningful feedback about how priorities are changing or how a missing aspect needs to be brought up higher or how a planned aspect actually needs to be lowered. The output of the sprint review meeting is that revised product backlog. If you've had good conversations during that meeting, the stakeholders have provided some input to the product owner, and the product owner can now take that and make some adjustments. It's important that during the sprint review, you're going to get feedback from the stakeholders. The conversation should not be feedback on the feedback, right? So for example, if some stakeholder says, I want it to work counterclockwise instead of clockwise, the feedback is helpful because it expresses the stakeholder's goals or desires. If the team says, well, you asked for it this way and now you want it this way, and I don't like the way you're presenting this, you're coming across as fickle or whimsical, that feedback on the feedback is not helpful. What you want to do is you want to take that feedback and say, it's important information, we're going to consider it, and we're going to use that in our adjustment. So that revised product backlog doesn't necessarily need to happen immediately. You can think about the feedback and use that feedback rather than immediately saying, well, we're not adjusting the product backlog because we didn't like your feedback. One of the key things that you're trying to do with the stakeholders is get that shared understanding. The team should be hearing the priority and the context. So for example, one of the stakeholders might say, hey, you know, there's new developments in the market. Our competitor is adding this feature and we haven't prioritized that feature. Or we might get feedback from users. We delivered something last sprint. They thought it was good, but it was missing this aspect. Or talking about release dates. We have 6 sprints to go before we release this feature, but the market is asking us to get it out there sooner, or we see competitive pressure to get it out sooner. So we're going to try and create a shorter release date. There are other relevant details that will help the Scrum team. Some common misconceptions. A sprint review is not a sprint demo. So demonstration is a part of sprint review, but it's really about getting information that will help you adapt. That's what makes a sprint review meeting different. The goal is to be able to influence priorities, influence the depth of scope, or be able to split items, anything that can help either refine the product backlog or change the product backlog in a positive, meaningful way. That is a great outcome from a sprint review meeting. So let's talk about some of the key things. It's an inspection and adaptation opportunity, this sprint review meeting. There's collaboration, and the goal is to revise that product backlog. So let's do another activity. Here, go into your workbook and find the worksheet called Sprint Review Meeting. You will see an infographic with some areas that need to be filled in. So move the cards into the area that best matches the words on that card. I'll give you a minute to perform this exercise. Okay, the sprint review meeting. Let's talk through each of these elements. So the purpose of a sprint review meeting is to inspect the product increment and adapt the product backlog as needed. In the upper right-hand corner, the time box, it's a maximum of 1 hour for every 1 week of sprint. So a 2-week sprint would have 2 hours. The approach here is to have 2 parts. The first is to demo the product and do some questions and answers. And then the second is to have a collaborative discussion about where the product needs to go next and how things might need to be adapted. Let's talk about the inputs. So the product increment developed during the sprint is the input. What's going to happen is the team and stakeholders are going to discuss the business context for the product. And the output of the sprint review meeting is to revise that product backlog based on those conversations and a shared understanding so that the Scrum team knows what to do next. Let's pause for questions. So the third part is the sprint retrospective. This is a meeting, and it is the final event of the sprint. So remember, the sprint is the containing event, and we started with sprint planning. We had a daily scrum every day throughout the sprint, and then we had a sprint review meeting where the stakeholders and the Scrum team inspected the product increment. Now there's a meeting as a final event, and we want to have this directly after the sprint review meeting. Remember, every Scrum event occurs within a sprint. That's the containing event. So what is the importance of this sprint retrospective? Again, inspect and adapt. So let's look at the sprint in its entirety. Let's talk about the Scrum team and how they're doing. And let's talk about how we're applying the Scrum framework. So the goal and the importance is really about that continuous improvement. We want a stronger Scrum team, and we want to look at consistent themes around impediments and blockers and address those. So who attends? Well, the entire Scrum team should attend. There should be collaboration between members in this meeting. And the Scrum Master really should ensure that these crucial conversations happen. And to some extent, the Scrum Master could prompt these conversations. The time box is 45 minutes for a 1-week sprint. And we increase that to 1.5 hours for a 2-week sprint. So how will a retrospective occur? Well, one of the things is we should focus on people and their relationships, individuals and interactions. And we should also look at the processes and the tools. So to give that an example, let's say one person needs help but doesn't ask for it early enough. That could be a good conversation. Another thing on the process and tools is perhaps the pair programming that we're doing, or the GitHub code reviews we're doing, or our continuous integration that we're using is having problems, right? Let's talk through how we're actually implementing these processes, how we're doing these tools. Maybe our daily scrums are running long. They're going to 20, 25 minutes. How are we going to do better the next sprint? We do want to focus on what we're doing well. This is an important thing because we want to continue to do what we're doing well. Maybe we were doing something well in the sprint before this. Maybe we need to restart that. In the end, the retrospective should come up with improvements that we can implement, something actionable. And we want follow through to produce results. It is the Scrum Master who looks for these improvements, makes sure that they're actionable and that there's planned action, and that follow through occurs on that plan. So any unimplemented improvements isn't going to benefit the team. So there are two basic areas that teams start to focus on. New teams will typically focus on their own internal improvements. What can we do to get better? As a team grows and gets a little bit more established in the things that they're doing, they're going to look at the broader organization. Perhaps they've developed some new and better ways of developing software. How can they communicate those and teach other teams? Maybe there's a part of the organization that's causing some slowdown or impediments. Maybe there's some delay. What can we do within the organization to improve that situation? So this continuous focus on improvement is going to help the organization gain in effectiveness over time. So let me pause here for an activity. So go to the Sprint Retrospective page. You'll see cards there, and place those cards in the best position to complete each sentence. I'll take a moment while you complete this activity. Okay, let's talk through each one, starting on the upper left-hand side. The purpose of the Sprint Retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and improve effectiveness. Next, the Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to individuals and interactions, process, and tools, and their definition of done. The most impactful improvements are addressed as soon as possible or added to the backlog. The next, on the upper right-hand corner, the retrospective meeting concludes the sprint and is time boxed to 45 minutes for a 1-week sprint. The Scrum team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it encountered, and how those problems were or were not solved. The idea of a sprint retrospective is very important because teams use these retros. They will reflect and adjust their behaviors. They're going to continuously improve, and that will have a positive impact on the organization. I'll pause for questions. The next module, which is the last module, we'll talk about Scrum artifacts, the product backlog refinement, the sprint backlog, the increment, and definition of done.